shooting down my suspect isn't enough. If he's a good detective, he has to give reasons as to why candidate Y is the murderer. What makes life valuable if there is no God?
Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that fewer people today care whether Christianity is true than care whether it is actually good.
Whew. Man, we got a lot to cover about Frank Turek today as we go through Frank Turek's YouTube shorts. Now, normally in Frank Turek's seminars and his little question and answer sections, he covers a lot of ground, but I feel like he covers as much, if not more ground in these shorts. So if y'all wanna fuck around and find out how bad Frank Turek's YouTube shorts are, then please stay tuned. What's up, heathens? My name's Brosaphus, and I am come here to tell you about the problem of thickness. Now, normally thickness is a good thing in a lot of areas of life, but today we're talking about your thick-ass wallet. I mean, just look at the size of this thing. Don't you hate it when that happens? Well, now you can abracadabra this sumbitch into a new Ridge wallet. It's sleek and small, and it's definitely not gonna try to sodomize you like that big old wallet. It holds up to 12 cards and has enough room for cash on the back. Ridge wallets provide you with over 30 colors and designs, including rose gold. And of course, one of my favorites, burnt titanium. They're made of a durable material, so they have a lifetime warranty. Have you ever wanted to just shrink this down so it's easier to carry and it doesn't nearly slice your leg off when you get into the car? Abracadabra! See? Now you can shrink down your keys too. So nice and compact, and the keys will fan out really easily. So if you want to get yourself a Ridge key case or a Ridge wallet, head on over to ridge.com/Godless Engineer now so that you too can get 10% off of these wonderful items. Alright, now go and enjoy your video. What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? I'm the Godless Engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Frank Turek's YouTube shorts. We are going to be covering 3 of his shorts today. The first one is going to be on the topic of explaining reality without God. Of course, the Christian's way of doing this is just saying, well, God did it. And that is pretty much the answer for everything. So let's see how Frank Turek thinks the discussion on God's existence should actually go.
If I'm a detective and atheist Michael Shermer is a detective and we come on a dead body.
That's a really fucking weird thing to say. God damn it. Like that sounds like some serial killer psychopath shit. What? Oh. No, oh, my bad. Took that completely the wrong way. Woo! Shit. Anyways, that's a really weird thing to say, that both you and Michael Shermer stumble upon a dead body. I know that he's setting up some kind of scenario here to give, I guess, an analogy for what he's thinking about, but still, it's kind of a weird thing to say. I think he's been talking to J. Warner Wallace a little bit too much for this particular short.
And I say, okay, I'm looking at all the evidence here. I think candidate X did it. And Michael Shermer says, no, candidate X did it. Or didn't do it. That's the wrong, he's not the murderer. And I say, okay, who is the murderer then? And he says, well, I just lack a belief that your guy's the murderer.
So, first of all, I feel like if this were an actual crime scene in which Frank Turek and Michael Shermer, which I have to say, that's gotta be like a comedic duo to put in some kind of like police comedy. Not like a serious cop show? Like, this is a comedy cop show because you got Frank Turek, somebody who has no detective experience whatsoever. Michael Shermer, who also has no detective experience whatsoever, are thrown into the mix of policing, and they have to figure out who done it. What the fuck would you even call that kind of cop show? SkeptiCops. One's a skeptic, one's a believer in God. Who will you believe? So I feel like that's the really wrong question to ask if you're in that situation, or how that situation would really play out. So you got Frank Turek, this guy's microscopes and all of his like science shit out, and he's looking at all the evidence, and he's like, candidate X did it. I know he did it. And here's the evidence. And Shermer's over there like, you know what? I don't think he did. And then the next question to ask is, why do you not believe that? Like, what pieces of evidence don't seem to line up for you that points you in the direction of this candidate X over here? And then, of course, then the discussion can move forward. This is the evidence, and this is why that evidence doesn't convince me of this candidate as being the murderer. Now, that's how it should go, but in Frank Turek's mind, that's not how it goes. Because in Frank Turek's mind, he asks, well, who is the murderer? And you don't have to know who the murderer is. I mean, the evidence to point to in the direction towards the actual murderer may not even be there. Maybe it's a knife that you find stashed away 3 blocks down or something like that. Like, it could be anything, but just because you're not convinced the evidence points in one direction doesn't mean that you have to come up with an alternative direction for the evidence to point to. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't have that. Just saying that it's not required in order to refute why this candidate is not the murderer. That's not how it works in Frank's head, though, because he's like, well, who is the murderer? And of course, in his mind, Shermer's like, well, I just like a belief that he is a murderer. And that's also not how detective work would go or how this conversation would go. Because I believe that anybody that is a reasonable person would be like, well, here are the reasons why I don't believe that guy is the murderer. Of course, Frank Turek is trying to put this in the context of atheists saying that I just lack a belief in God. And we have to come up with some kind of alternative explanation for things when we really don't. He's saying, well, I lack a belief in this. And I mean, lack of belief, don't believe. I hate the lack of belief like phrasing there because I feel like it leaves you open to a lot of issues. I just don't believe that guy's the murderer. And you can explain why you don't believe that. Just like in the God discussion, I can explain to you why I don't believe that Yahweh exists. I can tell you why I think the evidence does not support your conclusion that the Abrahamic God exists. I can explain this to you, and I do that all the time. So it's not just like I lack a belief in this. I'm saying that I don't believe in your conclusion, and that's it. I don't have to come up with an alternative explanation for anything. If your evidence doesn't support your conclusion, then that's all that I need to say that your conclusion doesn't make sense. Fucking dumbass.
Is he a good detective? No.
I feel like yes, he is, because if the evidence doesn't support the conclusion that candidate X is the murderer, then somebody should say that. That's how innocent people get thrown in jail. That's why the Innocence Project exists. Like, are you fucking like, is he a good detective? Yes, he's a good detective because he's been able to suss out that your conclusion is shit. Now, does that mean that he won't come up with an alternative person, like another candidate, in order to catch the murderer? No, it doesn't say that he's not going to do that. It just says that your conclusion's shit there, Frank.
Shooting down my suspect isn't enough.
Yes, it is. Shooting down the idea that God exists, the Abrahamic God exists, or anything like that is good enough. Just because your God doesn't exist doesn't mean that a God doesn't exist. But what we're saying is that your God doesn't exist, and we don't believe that any God exists. And we don't have to come up with alternative explanations for anything in order to be justified in not believing in your God, or any God for that matter.
If he's a good detective, he has to give reasons as to why candidate Y is the murderer.
Right. And he will give reasons when he presents candidate Y. But maybe he doesn't have any reasons just yet. He just knows that your reasoning for candidate X is bullshit. And that's all he has to have in order to reject your candidate X. Seriously, Frank, do you not know how this shit works? Because I feel like your whole logical reasoning, like compass or what the fuck ever you have, is just on the fritz. Maybe it's been on the fritz your entire life, but you're fucked up, bro.
Not just to say that your guy is the wrong guy. That's all I'm saying, Scott.
Well, Scott, I hope that you understand how much of a dipshit Frank is, okay? Because we don't have to come up with any alternative explanations for anything to not believe in his God or any God whatsoever. And speaking of explanations for things that Frank thinks that atheism needs to answer for, we're coming up on our next video where Frank is going to refute the idea that evolution explains morality. Now, the evolution of morality, or why morality is beneficial to our species, may be explained by evolution, but as far as morality itself, like what is moral and immoral, is never explained by evolution. Evolution just explains why groups of organisms change and adapt over time. And while morality might play into that a little bit as far as the human species goes, what is moral and what is immoral has never been under the purview of evolution. This is similar to how most apologists view atheism as far as explaining our reality. Like we just saw Frank Turek go over, they think that atheism has to explain other aspects of reality that they can't explain without God. Atheism doesn't have to do that because all that we have to do is say, well, your evidence doesn't support your conclusion, therefore I don't believe in your God or in any gods, because nobody's evidence supports the conclusion that a God exists. And that's all that we gotta do. We don't have to provide alternative explanations. But because of this, it seems like apologists just invent things to explain morality and consciousness and all these other things. They invent reasons that we come up with, which is where this video comes in.
Where does this moral obligation come from that we ought not murder people?
Well, it comes from us there, Frank, because morality is inherently subjective. The whole idea that we ought not to murder people is a social norm that developed over thousands of years. You know, as we grew into bigger and bigger societies, it was not advantageous for us to just wantonly I can't say that word without laughing now. It's not advantageous of us to just wantonly kill each other in a society. We have to have order. We have to have, repercussions for actions. If a society is going to survive and thrive, we can't just have people going around killing people just because they don't like them. So that developed as a social norm that we now consider to be some ought. Like to be a part of a functioning society, you ought not to murder somebody. Now, of course, that's not, you ought not kill somebody, because there are nuances in which, may entail you killing somebody. So there are situations where killing somebody may not be immoral, but when we're talking about murder, we're talking about the illegal taking of human life. And so we cannot have that in a society that hopes to function, that hopes to survive, and hopes to thrive for a long period of time. So we have made this an ought. Just like morality, we have constructed this.
What makes life valuable if there is no God?
Whether there is a God or there isn't a God, we are the ones that value life. We are the ones that place values on things in our reality, on other objects in our reality. I'm not trying to dehumanize anybody as far as what Frank's talking about here, but what I'm talking about is other objects that we experience in our reality, humans included. We place value on those things. Even in our own lives, we have different values for different people in our lives. Like, I value my son and my wife far more than I value some random person out there. Now, does that mean that I don't value human life in general? No. It means that I value life in like a tiered way. As far as the ones that are closest to me, I value more than somebody that I'm not connected to. And that's just how it is for most people out there. Again, that doesn't mean that I don't value human life or people. It just means that I have a reasonable sense about who I place value on in this life.
Nothing. That's the problem.
No, that's not the problem, because you're wrong. We are the ones that place value on things. Also, does God really value life? I'm not seeing a whole lot of valuing life in the Bible. We just got done with the Old Testament in our daily Bible podcast, which you can get to by clicking that link in the description. But in the Old Testament, I really don't see God valuing life all that much. What does God value? At least in the Old Testament, he values people worshiping him. That's what he values. So it's not life that he values. He only values the lives of people that are obedient and worship him. That's it. A good example of this is all of the mass slaughter that happens in the Old Testament. If life was valuable to God, then he would not call for the slaughter of innocent children like he does in Numbers 31, in Samuel, and all of these places. God calls for the slaughter of little children. God even has the Holy Spirit come into Egypt and kill all the innocent firstborn children of the Egyptians. God does not value life. So I don't know what in the fuck Frank Turek is talking about, that life is only valuable in light of God, because I don't see God valuing life. I see God valuing his worship. I mean, if you want to talk about fragility, that's off the fucking charts.
You know, outside every road here, there is a speed limit, right? You can see right outside here, it might say 35 miles an hour. You can know the speed limit and deny that there was someone behind that speed limit. You can know it, but the reason there's a speed limit sign is because there's some authority that put that sign up, right?
Well, yes. And I mean, sometimes those speed limits, people disagree with them and they exceed them. I feel like most of the time people exceed speed limits in some kind of capacity. I feel like a speed limit sign is definitely not a good analogy for what he's trying to say here, because he's trying to say that God has imposed these moral laws on us, these moral authority. Our speed limit laws and speed limits in certain areas are not so fixed as Frank Turek is talking about. Because while there is an authority behind the speed limit signs, that's because we live in a society. If we take society out of it and just somebody puts up a speed limit sign on a road and there's like nobody there to enforce it, what does that even fucking mean? Why are you putting that up there, bro? I'm not going to follow that. I didn't agree to this. Of course, us living in our society, we have agreed to, follow the rules of the road whenever we get a license, and our society allows us to operate motor vehicles on a roadway. We've agreed to follow the laws of the road, and that's what that is. Now, morality is very different than that, in that we do have some laws on the books that seem to intersect with our morality, like don't murder people, you ought not to murder people, and stuff like that. The problem is that our sense of morality is subjectively built off of social norms in the society that we exist in, the norms of our parents that they teach us. And these can be radically different at times. Although they may share some commonalities with each other, they could be radically different. I really don't think that Frank Turek is thinking out his analogy here with the speed limit sign. And I think the simplistic thing that he's drawing from this is just that there's an authority that sets the speed limits, just like there's an authority, God, that sets the moral foundation. Everybody's moral foundation is subjectively built by them. And Frank seems to be confusing this absolute moral foundation that we have with the common foundation that is found within a society. Because everybody that's a productive member that's in our society, that's not causing trouble, not being thrown in jail or anything like that, we've all agreed to certain sets of social norms that we're all going to follow. Now, whether or not, that's because it's been imposed on us or anything like that, this is what we exist within. But we still all actively create our own moral foundations. And just because our moral foundations share some aspects in common with the rest of the society that we exist within doesn't mean that it's not subjective.
What we're talking about as Christians is not whether you can read the sign. We all agree you can. We're saying the only thing that makes sense for universal moral obligation, for universal morality, is a standard that we're obligated to obey, and that standard can only be God's nature.
I disagree with that, because I don't think that there's a universal moral standard that we all have to obey. I think that there's like a common moral foundation that everybody shares within their own given society. And I think that all societies could potentially have some overlapping portions of a moral foundation that we all adhere to because of how big societies are now. I think that there is sort of this core that produces a thriving and surviving society. But just because all of that is kind of what works for our social species does not mean that it's a universal moral standard or moral foundation like Frank is trying to make it out to be here. Of course, he is advocating for the Christian moral foundation, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, considering the fact that the Christian moral foundation has changed radically over the ages. If you just look a few hundred years ago, it was perfectly fine as a Christian to advocate for the ownership of another person as property. Chattel slavery. They use Christianity to, keep slaves in slavery for the longest time. And they rationalize keeping slaves with Christianity, because Christianity and their Bible has slave laws in it. It has God directly commanding the Israelites to purchase slaves from other nations. To suggest that Christianity provides the ultimate and absolute moral foundation is just ridiculous when you consider how this foundation of Christianity has changed so much over just the past couple of hundred years. So I really don't know what in the fuck Frank Turek is talking about here.
Evolution can't give you that. Evolution is a biological process that has no authority to tell you what to do.
I agree. Yep, that evolution does not explain morality, like what is moral, what isn't moral. It doesn't give you a moral foundation or anything like that. Evolution is a biological process that explains how organisms change and adapt to their environment over time. So I agree with him on this point. I don't know why he's bringing it up. It seems kind of fucking random. I don't know if the person that asked the question from the audience was like, evolution explains morality. What now? Boom, kind of thing. I don't know if that happened, but if anybody is saying, well, morality is explained by evolution, I feel like you got to explain that nuance a little bit. I think you can explain why morality factors into evolution as a beneficial trait of a social group. Like, I think you can explain it that way, but in the context of explaining what is moral and what is immoral, evolution doesn't help us. So don't use it that way, but you can explain why our moral sense developed using evolution, not what is moral. All right. So, in this particular section, we covered Christianity, its changing moral foundation, and how Christianity has changed over time. Now, Frank Turek is going to tell us why Christianity is good, why it's not pro-slavery, and why it's not anti-woman. These are just a couple of topics here that have changed in Christianity over time. Christianity definitely supported slavery up until 1865. And at that point, people started moving away from that interpretation of scripture. And now it's seen as abhorrent to own another person as a slave, just like with women. It's been very anti-women in Christianity in the past. Even still now, we have preachers that are very anti-women, that very much want to keep women subjected to the man and don't want to promote women in either their church or in society. So let's see what Frank has to say about it.
Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that fewer people today care whether Christianity is true than care whether it is actually good.
I mean, I care about whether or not Christianity is true. I think that's an important question to ask. And I think that we have to ask that question before we can get to whether or not Christianity is good. And I don't think that we can sit there and be like, oh, well, it's settled, Christianity's true. There's a very apologist way of taking it. But is Christianity good? Well, if we consider the content of Christianity, content of the Bible and the theology of Christianity, I would have to say no, it's not good. And I think that we could probably answer that before we even answer whether or not it's true, because I feel like Christianity being good and Christianity being true are mutually exclusive. So one doesn't depend on the other. So why is Christianity not good? Well, if you look at the Old Testament, obviously God commands the murder and slaughter of innocent people and children. He commands the taking of sexual slaves in the form of prepubescent girls, as well as sexual slaves in the form of women who have not lost their virginity, who were still virgins. So there's that. There's also his slaughter of his own people just because, they didn't worship him enough or they were a little uppity. They gave him some lip. There's the killing of innocent children in Egypt when the Pharaoh had his heart hardened by God just so that God could kill their children. There's that aspect of it, showing that Yahweh God, the Abrahamic God, is not a good God. He's not omnibenevolent. Now let's get to Christianity and its theology concerning Jesus. Now, what we learned from Sean McDowell earlier this week is that there's a toxic codependency that's built by having a relationship with this person, Jesus, with this celestial figure, Jesus, because what Christianity teaches you is that you need Jesus in order to be a good person or to be accepted by God or to be somehow accepted into heaven. Right? You cannot do it on your own. You can't be a good person on your own because people are inherently evil, which I disagree with, but whatever. You can't do it. Only Jesus can make you a good person that deserves to go to heaven. So this toxic codependency is built. And, honestly, that's even in the Old Testament because God creates a toxic codependency with the Israelite people because he says the only way that you're considered to be good and deserving of even life is if you worship me, creating this toxic codependent relationship that tells the Israelite people they are nothing. They're not even worth the life that they have without God. Through and through, Christianity seems to be just a horrible religion that's subversively telling you were nothing without him. God, Jesus, whatever.
What happened in the Christian church was that women were actually not only given leadership positions and positions of respect and honor within the religious community, but they were actually given financial support, and widows were taken care of, whether they were part of the Christian faith or outside of the Christian faith. And so they were being attracted to it because of the way in which Christians wanted to emulate what Jesus did.
I'm sorry, but I'm going to need a fucking citation on this shit. As far as prominent leadership positions, I couldn't find any prominent women in leadership roles prior to the 1800s, and that was with Protestants, which these guys are Protestants. Catholics controlled the scene for 1400 years or so until the Protestant Reformation happened. But even after that point, women weren't given prominent roles in the church. Now, unless he's talking about nunneries and nuns and everything like that, those were still submissive roles in the church. They had this whole idea that, of course, there's God in Christ, and then just below that there's man, and then below that there's the wife, and then below that are the children. That's the structure of the family unit in Christianity, and it was that way for the longest time. And it wasn't until about the 1800s until a woman was ordained as a priest. Now, there were women that were ordained in clergy positions outside of Christianity, like in Buddhism, but in Christianity, a woman being a leader is just not something that really existed until more recent times, like in the past few hundred years. So if we want to talk traditionally here, then you would need to say that women are traditionally submissive to the man in these situations, and they were not treated very well. In the Old Testament, women are treated as property. They are traded off and bartered with. You bought women with money back then. I mean, they want to romanticize how Jacob bought both Rachel and Rachel's sister, Leah. They will try to romanticize that and say he worked so hard for these women in order to be able to marry them. And it's no, he worked hard to buy them. Nobody asked if they wanted to be married to this jackass. Most certainly their father didn't ask Leah if she wanted to be just traded off in place of her sister. How emotionally damaging was that to her if she were to have even existed? But anyways, this whole notion that Christianity respects women, that treats women properly, and gives them these prominent positions in the church is just ignoring history.
Christianity is Jesus. It's not based on the immoral behavior of some Christians. It's based on the truth of Jesus, the beauty of Jesus. Just because I'm not true and beautiful doesn't mean Jesus isn't true and beautiful.
Okay, I get it. Based off Jesus and his sacrifice and everything like that. But you cannot forego what happens in the Old Testament. Jesus himself attaches his very being to the Old Testament by calling upon Moses, also calling upon like prophets like Isaiah and all this other stuff. Jesus is intimately tied to the Old Testament. Also, Jesus says that, God is the same now as he will be in the future and how he has been in the past. So if the God of the Old Testament is the same God of the New Testament, God's a dick. And I get that he wants to base his entire view of Christianity off of Jesus. But when you follow that rabbit hole and you fully explain what that means, you will see how God is still a dick. God still commanded the taking of slaves. God still commanded that women be treated like property. There's no way around this, and even Jesus reaffirms it with his dependency on the Old Testament.
The Bible, properly understood and properly lived out, is the cure for the very things it's often blamed for.
What? Okay, so what have we blamed Christianity for here? Well, we have correctly attributed the use of chattel slavery in both Christianity and in Judaism, or the Old Testament. As far as Christianity providing the solution for slavery, I don't see that at all. Of course, they could cherry pick verses out of the New Testament that seem to indicate that, slavery is bad. But that's not, when you look at the full context of what they're talking about in the New Testament, that's not what they're trying to say. They were definitely perfectly fine with chattel slaves being a thing. So slavery is not solved by Christianity. If slavery was solved by Christianity, then slavery would have stopped when Christianity became the dominant religion in Europe. It would have just fucking stopped, but it didn't. It didn't stop until way later. And that's when people with quote unquote heretical views of the scripture came forward and started making arguments using the Bible because they knew that that would convince people. People just couldn't think logically and rationally about the fucking question as to whether or not you should own another person as a slave. They had to be convinced because a magical book says they shouldn't, or that slaves shouldn't be a thing. They literally had to use a magical textbook in order to convince people not to own another person. Just let that sink in for a minute. And even then, it was a strained thing to do. During the Civil War, people had to actively be convinced that the abolition of slavery was a necessary thing to end the war. And so they really didn't care about it, but only because they wanted the war to end. And so it's like, well, if we got to free the slaves in order to end the war, then free the slaves. Oh, okay, well, if the war didn't depend on that, would you want the slaves freed? No. They said no. They didn't think the slaves should be freed because slavery was normalized at that time, and it was a heretical view to free the slaves. Now, as far as women go, it's all throughout the New Testament that women should be submissive to the man. And these sentiments even crop up now, with like the new independent fundamentalist Baptists. They all the time talk about how women shouldn't be allowed to vote, that women shouldn't be allowed to work. Women should be submissive to their husbands and stay at home and raise kids. And they should do this, that, and the other that puts them in a very submissive role that really downplays their role in society, thus making them as next to property as they can be. So you're going to sit there and tell me that Christianity is the answer for the maltreatment of women, for the racism that we have now, when Christianity was at the heart of creating systemic racism? No, it's not the answer for anything. Well, that's going to be it for the 3 videos today. These were a lot quicker because Frank Turek, I don't know. If I were to, maybe I should do that one day for a video. Tear out all the apologists, pointing out which ones are better than the others. Of course, this is taking a whole bunch of piles of shit and rating each pile of shit as far as like which pile of shit's better than the other. But I feel like Frank Turek is definitely lower on the list than Sean McDowell. But Frank, I mean, he's just, I don't know. It's incredibly hard for me to take Frank seriously when he has such bad arguments. But all the apologists have bad arguments. So if you will, please let me know what you thought about Frank Turek's performance here. Do you think he made any good points? Or do you think he's kind of shit like I think he is? Let me know down below in the comments. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.